Donzi, Tashdile, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to all our speakers and to our lovely live audience tuning in from across the world. Welcome to Freedom Hour, an online event hosted by Asia Freedom Institute, which is a nonprofit organization that calls for democracy and religious freedom in Tibet and China. I'm Sakina Bhatt, the moderator for Asia Freedom Institute's Freedom Hour. For today's panel, we have representatives from various communities affected by human rights violations by the CCP. Today, we will explore the importance of youth advocacy in addressing these issues and discuss how young activists and leaders can work together to bring about change. Our panelists will also share their unique perspectives and experiences. We have Anna Kwok, Executive Director of Hong Kong Democracy Council, Marta Iliquid, Project Researcher at Uyghur Transitional Justice Database, Temilon Togochok, Southern Mongolian activist, Pema Doma, Executive Director of Students for Free Tibet, and Yuki Zhang, Research Fellow at Citizen Power Initiatives for China. I welcome all of you to the panel today. Thank you so much for giving us your time and day today. So let me quickly run through the agenda for today. Firstly, we will be starting off with a general question for each of the speakers, and you have 3 minutes for your answer, followed by the first round of individual questions where you also have 3 minutes. And then we have the second round of individual questions that also requires 3 minutes. And at the end, if we have time, then we will have a last general question, which requires just 2 minutes. Okay, so without further ado, I would like to start off with Anna, the general question. So why is youth advocacy crucial in raising awareness, promoting justice, and addressing issues related to your respective communities? Can you share with us an instance where youth activism has played a significant impact in the cause that you represent, given that you are all very experienced and have this really unique background regarding activism? Anna.
Thank you so much for the question, and thanks for having me. So to talk about youth activism, I think it's very important to also understand the background of Hong Kong, because I was born in 1997. It was the year when Hong Kong sovereignty was handed over from the United Kingdom to China. And I think for my generation, who are around 25 and 26 years old now, it was really important for us to see the possibility of having youth who can lead the movement. So we actually didn't see that, I think, for a major part of our childhood, because back then a lot of the protests were led by, organized adults who would, fight for Hong Kong's freedom. But eventually, I think students started getting their voice when it was 2012, when Joshua Wong and others have joined Scholarlism to start some students' campaign. And in 2014, during the umbrella movement, it was really the trend and the understanding that the students were the leaders of the movement. And I think it was only through that that we were able to innovate and also advance our agenda, because for the entire Hong Kong movement, it went from a more modest fight for democracy to eventually actually being daring to say we need universal suffrage. And eventually, youth really take it up again to demand self-determination. And in 2019, of course, when the most recent movement, and could be the last one in many years to come, broke out, a lot of the protesters were students. So from some numbers I got yesterday, actually 40% of those who were arrested in 2019 were students, and also 40% of those who have been persecuted were also students. It just goes to show, students are really the backbone of the movement. And one instance that I was involved in 2019 that I think really made a huge impact was that I led an international campaign, even though I stayed mostly anonymous and I worked online. But I led an international campaign really trying to organize volunteers from around the world, Hong Kongers from around the world, to put up, international ads and media campaigns to ask the world to stand with us, especially at the G20 summit where global leaders were attending at the time. And it actually opened up the door to grassroots advocacy, because back then, people always thought that advocacy is something that is done by politicians, maybe, or, nonprofits or very polished organizations. Nobody really thought that, the mass, the netizens who are online, who don't even have a real name, like myself, I was hiding behind, an anonymous profile at the time. People didn't think it was possible for us to do campaigning. But that campaign at the G20 summit really opened up the possibility. We managed to crowdfund millions of dollars within a few hours, and we managed to put up, all the ads across the globe within 2 days. So after the campaign, actually, because we were anonymous, a lot of people thought we must be a bunch of, 40, 50 years old adults who are seasoned enough in the advertising industry. But no, that's not the truth. The majority of us were actually just students, and we led the entire campaign. So I think people have to have faith in the youth. And I also made a promise to myself that, 10 years down the road, or even 5 years down the road, I have to listen to the students. I have to listen to what they are thinking, what they want to do, because I can't be in the way of, younger voices and youth innovations. And I think that is essentially the spirit that renews and revitalizes every movement and every society. So I'm really happy to be here today, and I really want to hear from my fellow panelists as well, because I believe youth movement and youth voices are always the integral to great changes that we will be continuing to see.
Thank you so much, Anna, for your perspective. Let's hear Martyrs.
Yes, thank you, Sakina, for the introduction, and thank you for having me. Of course, I agree. I agree with Anna. I do also believe that youth activism is crucial for many different reasons, because young activists, they often possess a unique ability to amplify voices that may otherwise be marginalized. And this can be done through the use of social media, digital platforms, and grassroots organizing. We can reach a much more a vast audience, and youth are also able to bring fresh perspectives to the table and innovative approaches. And more importantly, youth activism has a powerful mobilizing effect, just as what we've seen during the student demonstrations in Hong Kong. And by organizing such protests, awareness campaigns, we can unite diverse communities and support and solidarity, and create a coalition with other social justice movements. From my own experience, our youth activism domestically in Norway, because I was raised in Norway, it has covered, like, through the past few years, it has covered a range of issues. For instance, we have there was this open call on the government to withdraw from their free trade negotiations with China. There are 9 political parties in our parliament, and each of them has their own youth parties. And 2 years ago, we did manage to mobilize all these youth parties to join our call regarding the free trade negotiations, which we believe is very immoral, because the terms and conditions of this agreement mean that Norway practically accepts the oppression of minorities and supports the dictatorial system and allies itself with a genocidal regime. We're basically compromising our democratic values and principles for economic interests. And never ever in the history has a dictator possessed such a strong economic and political power as the CCP does today. And by entering into such a free trade agreement, we do not only contribute to strengthening the dictatorship, but also further undermining our democracy and freedom of expression. The result of this campaign was that it was suspended. And the only reason behind the suspension is because of human rights issues, but it's not fully withdrawn, which means that we still have a long way to go. And besides this, our youth group have been actively engaging with youth parties in lots of other areas, such as parliamentary recognition of the Uyghur genocide and crimes against humanity, which is still an ongoing issue at the moment. So I believe that youth advocacy has the potential to create a long-lasting challenge by shaping public opinion and influencing policy, and by consistently advocating for justice, human rights, and accountability. I believe young activists can sway public opinion and compel policymakers to take action. Thank you.
Thank you, Martyr. And I totally agree with you when you spoke about the social media, like how the youth activists can use social media as a medium. And we have more questions on that, and we shall delve more into that later. Thank you. And let's hear Temulun's perspective.
Hello, Sakina, and thank you again for inviting me here. In response to that question, I agree with the first two speakers, and I think it's very important for the younger generations to take on the fight for freedom, as we are the next coming generation and we are the future generation. So as, like, for example, Gen Z, we need to take charge of this. And especially young people like myself, I was born and raised in America. So my father came here on political asylum from southern Mongolia. So especially for young people like me who were raised in a free democratic world, it's so important for us to use that privilege and recognize that privilege and use it to speak up for the people that are voiceless, the voiceless Southern Mongolians and Uyghurs and Hong Kongers and Tibetans, in order for our voice to potentially be heard. And one example of this for me was when I spoke at the UN for the first time, which was like around a month ago, I would say. And that was a very, that was kind of like a wake-up call for me, because I realized how many people wanted to see a young face representing an issue like this, because especially from my father, I hear that he really wants the younger generations to take interest in issues like these. So for me to kind of adopt what he has been fighting for pretty much his whole life, and for me to speak at the UN in front of the Chinese government delegates was really important. And I feel like it was very powerful for me to speak and realize the importance of my words and my own voice. And I think another thing is having the younger generations promote these causes. It also connects us to our roots and our culture, because as someone, I've never been to southern Mongolia because my father's here in political asylum. So I've never seen my family, my cousins, my aunts, and this in a way is allowing me to fight for that and fight for my culture and my community and my people, and hopefully to be able to see them one day and go back to my motherland and experience that. So thank you.
Hopefully, Temulun, we also aspire to go to our own homeland back in Tibet as well. And yeah, Temulun, I would like to thank you on screen for being with us today. You spoke really bravely at the UN, and we could think of no one but you from the Southern Mongolian to be with us and to be a part of this discussion today. And I really like to thank you and appreciate your presence because you took a day off from your school to be with us. Thank you, Temulun. Pamela, let's hear your perspective.
So yes, thanks so much, Sakina, for inviting us and creating this space for so many amazing voices to come together. I think when I think about the situation of Tibet, if you think about, it goes all the way back to my grandparents' time, really, in the Tibetan case. When Tibet first lost its independence, its freedom in the 1950s, my grandfather was at that time someone who maybe could have been on this panel. He was, 19 or 20 years old. And just as the Ukrainians are doing today, he actually joined into the guerrilla force to take up arms and defend Tibetan sovereignty. And this was through the Chushi Kangjuk, where tens of thousands of Tibetans, mostly young people, mostly youth, came together to defend Tibet. And then I think about how the time has changed since then. And now Tibetans have kind of shifted to this thing called strategic nonviolence. And many Tibetans use campaigning, they use advocacy as the nonviolent ways, the peaceful ways to fight the same battle, really, though. We're still fighting for the same cause that we fought for 60 years ago. And I think about myself as someone just like, Temelin seeing her today and hearing from her. I can also relate and resonate with that a lot, as can thousands and thousands of Tibetans and Southern Mongolians living around the world, as well as Uyghurs. And I think that if there hadn't been this opportunity for youth voices and young people to learn about our causes and become involved, the Chinese government may have already won by now. But the reality is that until the young people, until the youth stop caring about this issue, until we stop fighting for it, both inside Tibet and outside of Tibet, until the next generation thinks that this cause is not worthy, the Chinese government really can never win. So I think that the involvement of the new generation, whether right now it may be us on the screen here today, and as Anna said, in 10 or 15 years, it may be another new generation. Until that next new generation is still fighting for what we believe in, what my grandparents and Temelun's father believed in, until the next generation no longer believes in that, we always have a hope that our fight can prevail, and that our mission together will be successful. And the last thing I wanted to mention as well is that I think the way that we've seen success in our movements right now, like something that only the youth energy could really bring, is an example of the cross movement work. When I think about the cross movement work that's being done between Hong Konger youth, Uyghur youth, Southern Mongolia, and Chinese and Tibetans, this level of cross movement activism and solidarity, just being connected at the core, that really has been led. And I even see older generations in many ways looking up to the younger generation and seeing how amazing it is to see the young people. We have folks like Anna, people from HKDC like Alex Chow, who have been on the ground in Hong Kong, who have been doing these political advocacy campaigns, such as the G20 campaign that Anna spearheaded anonymously in 2019. And then we see young people like Mutar who are creating like really great research. And then somehow like all of them coming together and creating one voice as a cross movement space. Like this is something that I believe that the youth activism has really made it possible and really enhanced that work. So I just wanted to mention that as well.
Thank you, Pamela. And it's really nice and interesting to know that your grandfather was from the guerrilla movement. So now we know where you get your advocacy skills from. So thank you, Pamela. Yuki, let's hear your take on this.
Yeah, so I was born and raised in Beijing and moved to the US for college about like 12 years ago. And I can definitely tell there has been a change in terms of student movements. In the past, Chinese students were just known for a bunch of quiet students studying abroad, focus on what they, like things happening in school. But recently, we've been seeing a lot of students who used to barely speaking out were getting involved in those political agenda or dispute. Today they are playing a really important role or leading role in student movements since last December, October, I've been organizing and participating in the white paper revolution against the COVID-related restrictions and against the Chinese authorities. So many of the protesters and leaders, both in China and overseas, they are students from the younger generation. They come from different backgrounds. They have learned or experienced the Chinese government's wrongdoings and violation of human rights. And I think that demonstrates a strength of the student body's willingness to seek for truth and act upon their judgments. So, for example, when we were organizing the demonstrations last year around DC school campuses, we received tremendous help from many student organizations and including like ordinary students who came from China and studying in the US. So I think given the current political climate and the tightened surveillance in China, it's really brave for them to step out and speak for themselves, risking, like the potential surveillance and censorship by the authorities. Especially when saying something directly against the CCP and criticizing President Xi, which was rarely seen in the past decades or so. So I think that's a really good sign, and we hope to see more young leaders around the world to mobilize and telling their personal stories and expressing their criticism against any totalitarian regime.
Thank you so much, Yuki, for sharing us your perspective. It was really nice to have different perspectives from different speakers belonging from various communities. And also Asia Freedom Institute is seeking for an alliance building. And I really hope that we get to have more of these kind of conversations again. And maybe we can even meet physically someday. So moving on to the individual questions. So Anna, like you said, you chose to reveal your previously anonymous identity and commit to the cause of freedom in Hong Kong, which is undoubtedly a very brave decision of you. And recently, in a congressional hearing, you spoke about the failure of the international treaties with the Chinese Communist Party and the rapid rise of the political prisoners in Hong Kong. There are actions taken by the international communities. They have sanctioned the Chinese government for various reasons, but still we see that there is not much progress when it comes to human rights. So what should be done by the international community in addressing these issues? How can the international communities combat these challenges?
Definitely a great question that we have to focus on. So first and foremost, I think, is to stop thinking that human rights dialogues are useful. One thing that governments around the world always does is that they proclaim that they have human rights dialogues with China, but then actually what they do is put human rights concerns into a bucket, and they continue to talk about trade, talk about all those cooperation on the side, thinking that, oh, as long as we have talked about human rights and mentioned the word human rights of people, in Hong Kong and Tibet and the Uyghurs, then it's okay. It's not okay. Just stop having those human rights conversations and instead have human rights discussed when you're talking about trade as well. When you're talking about organizing, whatever summit, whatever Olympic Games that you're going to have. But practically speaking, I just want to list, some of the items that we have been working here in the U.S. First thing is definitely humanitarian pathways in terms of, immigration assistance for people who are in impacted areas. And this is something that we have been fighting for a long time since the 2019 movement, because a lot of protesters had to flee Hong Kong, of course. And because US and a lot of Western countries have been such huge supporters of the movement for democracy and freedoms, we thought, okay, these countries would be willing to accept the Hong Kongers who had to flee. But in reality, it's not as optimistic as that. A lot of governments, including the US government, has not been really thinking of long-term solutions. They are only thinking of temporary reliefs. But that is not sufficient, especially when transnational repression is so rampant these days. And I think it's not only for Hong Kongers as well. We have been fighting for humanitarian pathways jointly with our Uyghur friends here in the US because they also face the same problem. And the asylum system just means, an endless limbo for people. Even though I'm on the asylum as well, I'm applying for the asylum, but I don't know how many years it's going to take, for me to actually finally get, even a yes or no. And besides helping the impacted through immigration pathways, another thing is thinking about sanctions. So Sakina has mentioned that a lot of sanctions have been imposed on individuals, but is that enough? I would argue no, because, for example, in November, the coming November, there's this APEC summit that will be organized in the US. And the APEC summit, because APEC has the Hong Kong government as one of the members, they will probably invite the Hong Kong government over to the US in San Francisco. And the representative that the Hong Kong government is going to send is probably John Lee, the chief executive of the Hong Kong government. But he is actually sanctioned by the US government. So imagine the scene of a US sanctioned individual stepping foot on American soil and to attend, a summit organized by the US to talk about trade with the US. I think it's just ridiculous that on one hand, you say that, okay, this guy is sanctioned. But on the other hand, you still have these, chit chats with him. You still cooperate with him. I think the US has to really think about, and not only the US, the world as well, have to think about what sanctions actually mean. Do they want to just send a message, or are they actually committed to sanctioning people? That's the thing that they have to think about. And a few other things include diversifying investments in China, as well as reconsidering the economic reliance that people have built on Chinese economy. Actually, since the Russian invasion of Ukraine, I thought countries would be better about it because they have seen how much they have heavily relied on Russia, for instance, in terms of natural resources. But I think as the invasion has gone on for some time now, it seems that that worry has kind of faded out. And even though people have made more long-term plans of diversifying from Russia, people have to look at China and think about how their economic reliance is actually building themselves a huge trap for themselves down the road. And that is also something the international community should do. And last but not least, we mentioned, how Beijing is actually breaching international treaty, the joint Sino-British Declaration on Hong Kong. And I think it goes to show how they're just not a very credible international player, because they're willing and they dare to just walk away from a treaty, even though they have previously promised to honor it. And it's going to repeat again and again because they know the world is not going to actually hold them accountable, even if they do breach any treaties. And that's why the world really has to look at all the treaties that the Chinese government has breached before and decide to hold them accountable in ways that actually hurt them. So actually imposing useful sanctions and utilize the sanctioning tools and diversifying their economic partners, and also just providing humanitarian pathways and being willing to stand up for those human rights defenders who really believed in the universal values that a lot of these countries claim to believe in. So these are just some baby steps, I think. A lot of international communities have to take. And I also appreciate the cross-movement work we have been doing together throughout the years. And we have been calling the same thing over and over again. And of course, we're seeing a little progress step by step, but still we have to keep pushing.
Thank you so much, Anna, for your really strong points. And I also believe that sanctions should be taken really seriously, and human rights issues should be spoken when it comes to the trade relations with China or the Olympics. And also, we should start, the international community should start thinking about long-term solutions rather than temporary reliefs. Thank you, Anna. Moving on to Martyr. So Mathur, as a project researcher at the Uyghur Transitional Justice Database, what are some of the challenges you face in collecting and analyzing data on the disappearing and extrajudicially interned Uyghurs? How do you ensure the accuracy and reliability of the information that you are gathering, given that there is this mass surveillance by the CCP in the Uyghur and in the East Turkestan region?
Yeah, it's a great question. I'll just separate it into two parts. So in terms of challenges, cybersecurity is one of the most significant challenges that we confront. Our team have encountered cybersecurity attacks targeting our digital devices, and there's always this unknown login attempts from various IP addresses around the world that have been detected on our communication channels such as Signal, Telegram, and WhatsApp. And we even have also received notifications from Google indicating that our private emails are potentially exposed to government-backed attacks, and this happens to only less than 0.0001% of the Google users. And besides, our team have experienced several times that the computers and devices have been stopped working, and when we send those devices to security control, we find that on one of the devices, it was there was more than 200 unknown software that was being installed tracking our online activities. And those are just crazy and scary. And another significant challenge that we face is linked to threats and harassment, in other words, transnational repression. Every team member has, in our team, who are Uyghurs, they have their family members or loved ones in camps in East Turkestan with some experience in harassment and others arbitrary detention because of the work we do. And certain volunteers in our team have been compelled to resign from their jobs to ensure the safety of their family members. And also, due to the nature of our work, we have to travel a lot, particularly to Turkey and other countries where there's substantial diaspora community. We have, like during those travels, we have encountered instances of being surveilled by unidentified individuals while we're walking on the streets, although we do report about such instances to the Norwegian embassy wherever we go, but the available options for solutions appears to be very limited. And in terms of ensuring the accuracy and availability of the, I think you meant reliability, right, of the information that we gather. First of all, our methodology, research methodology, is based on direct testimony collection. This would include first-hand testimonies of camp survivors or eyewitnesses of the concentration camps who are now living in diaspora, reporting about their experiences. And it's also largely relied on the diaspora community, where individuals who lost their family members in camps register this information with us. And we create more than 60 data points for each registered individual, ranging from their political atmosphere, religious background, level of education and everything, this makes our research particularly deep, and we use those data for policy pattern analysis. And of course, in doing so, we do prioritize the protection of sources and testimonies. We take extensive precautions to ensure the safety and anonymity of the individuals providing the information if they decide to do so. And this then includes using, for example, secure communication channels, employing encryption methods, and minimizing the digital footprint of our interactions with the testifiers. And secondly, we do also employ meticulous verification process, and this involves cross-referencing and corroborating information from multiple independent sources whenever it's possible. And by triangling those testimonies and evidence, we aim to establish a consistency and enhance the reliability of the gathered information. And lastly, we do also, of course, adhere to internationally recognized standards for human rights documentation and data collection. And this includes ensuring informed consent, protecting the privacy of individuals, and following certain ethical guidelines in our research. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, thank you so much, Marta, for sharing us your view on this. Okay, now moving on to Temaloon. Temaloon, like you've mentioned, at the United Nations Permanent Forum on International on Indigenous issues, you have spoken really bravely, like I've mentioned before as well, on the suppression of the Mongolian customs, rituals, and language. And you urged the international community to hold China accountable for its ongoing cultural genocide in the southern Mongolia. What do you believe is the role of the international institutions like the United Nations in addressing such issues, and how impactful or effective has it been so far?
Yeah, so that was my first time speaking in front of such a large audience at such a high-level meeting. So I was kind of nervous, but my love and my responsibility for my people made me speak up for thousands of representatives from indigenous peoples around the world. And I knew that there were Chinese government delegates in the room, and I was directly confronting them. And I learned that from my father. He is a very courageous man and just speaks up and confronts them directly. And I really am trying to adopt his very his bravery and courage to speak up for my people. And it's very difficult for civil societies to bring their issues directly to the attention of those responsible for the suffering of these groups of people. And in this sense, the United Nations, and like specifically the United Nations Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues, which is the one I attended, it has been instrumental in facilitating discussions about the challenges that Indigenous communities face. But on the other hand, the UN and other international human rights bodies still have a lot of room for improvement, because there are, in the past, like my father has been attending this meeting, specifically the Indigenous Peoples meeting, for 20 years, since it started pretty much. And we've been going to both the headquarters. He's been going to both the headquarters in Geneva and the UN in New York. And Geneva is a bit more, it allows him to speak more, and he's spoken more times. But in his entire 20 years of attending this meeting, he's only spoken in New York maybe like once, twice, something like that, because there are government, like there is an influence and there are pressures for the meeting themselves, like the people hosting these meetings. And they have literally admitted to my father that they don't allow him the chance to speak because of these external pressures. So in this sense, they do have room for improvement. And the UN is still not taking enough action or any significant action to combat China's cultural genocide in southern Mongolia and Tibet, and the ongoing genocide in East Turkestan, and the suppression of democracy in Hong Kong. And the suppression of our native language is comparable to like the Native American boarding schools. They were taken away, like children were taken away, and they were not allowed to speak their language. And just this is a huge part of our identity and our culture. And that's why it's so important for us to keep that, because if we lose this language, we lose a huge piece of who we are, which is why it's so important for the UN to take accountability and to give opportunities for Indigenous people to speak up.
Thank you so much, Tamalun, and I totally agree with you regarding the preservation of language. And we Tibetans, we are also doing everything in our capacity to preserve our Tibetan language. And so those of you who don't know, Tamalun is the daughter of Mr. Engabatu Togojok. He is the director of Southern Mongolian Human Rights Information Center, and he is a prominent figure in advocating for the Southern Mongolian rights. Thank you so much, Tamalun. Moving on to Pamela. So, Pamela, you've recently attended the event Youth for Tibet 2023 in Paris, where young activists from across Europe came together to discuss and develop their activism and advocacy skills. Can you share with us the key takeaways from the event, and how are events like this having a significant impact and contributing to broadening the Tibetan freedom movement? Why are such international collaborations important?
Absolutely. Thank you, Sakinullah, for the question. So just recently in May of 2023, SFT organized a joint training with Tibetan Youth Association of Europe, which is a Tibetan youth group that's based in the Schengen area. And the main goal of the Youth for Tibet was to make sure that the young people in all across Europe who are getting involved in the space of activism, who are finding their passion for Tibet in the past year or two. And many of those young people are 17, 18, 20 years old, maybe 22 years old. I would say the average age is probably about 19 or 20 years old at the training. And making sure, like, young folks, like even Tamalun, for example, like with her opportunities and experiences, she's able to go and deliver her truth at the United Nations, one of the world's largest human rights bodies. And giving also opportunities for young people to understand what it is that they may be able to contribute to the movement. And so at these trainings, we have a wide range of different workshops. So we definitely focus on grassroots activism, which means how do you educate your peers, the people at your universities or in your towns about this issue. We focus on strategic campaigning. So how do you start a campaign in your own community to counter the Chinese government, no matter where you are? And then we also do public speaking. If you're given the opportunity to speak in front of an audience about your issue, how do you frame your narrative in a way that will really touch the hearts and also minds of the people you're speaking with? And then we also have more trainings than that as well, but those are probably three that are very impactful for young people. So at this recent training, we had participants from different areas of France, a large number of participants from Paris, participants from the Netherlands, from Switzerland, and Portugal, and the United States. So I think it's just bringing together, like the number one first goal is to help get these skills trained in these young people. So since then, like the young folks that were there was about 7 or 8 young people there from the Netherlands, and a few of them go to like Erasmus University, and they've started working on this campaign now as well to shut down the Chinese government's influence at Erasmus University in the Netherlands. So this is a campaign that myself, no matter how great I am or may or may not be from New York City, I can't launch a campaign against the Chinese government's influence at Erasmus University in the Netherlands. Neither can Students for Free Tibet headquarters office in New York City. But when we're able to have these trainings with young people who are coming from these universities, they're students of the campus, the student body are all their friends, their peers. So it really is, they're the voice, they're the ones that need to be leading this fight. So having trainings like this in different regions, so we have trainings like this in Europe, in Asia, the Americas. Having these trainings allows like the opportunities for these types of issues to be led by the young people who are in the regions that really should be the voice. So I guess that's one of the primary goals. And the secondary goal is also now bringing together the young people from different regions. So we also held an advanced track at this session where we brought together young people from Portugal, Switzerland, the Netherlands, and the US and France, who have been a part of activism work for the past 2 to 3 years, and helped them develop their activism skills even further by doing more advanced trainings, such as teaching them how to give trainings to other young people on skills that they've also learned. So at this track, for example, like some of the young people, I realized they haven't met each other, even though they've been working in the same movement for 2 years. And I think like when we left the training, one of the funniest things they were saying was like, oh, I came in and like, 3 days later, I'm leaving Paris and I have a new best friend. So I think these are the ways in which the movement really becomes strong and activists start to forge those networks with one another. So I think, we went there, we had a set of goals that we wanted to accomplish, and we definitely were able to meet all of those during our time in Paris.
Thank you so much, Pamela. It was really nice to know about the various trainings that was being held at the event. And it was so nice to see the pictures of so many youth participants. It is really nice to see, so many Tibetans, young Tibetans taking part in youth activism. Thank you, Pamela. Yuki, your work with the Journal of Gender and the Law at Georgetown highlights your dedication to gender equality, and you have also specialized in learning gender discrimination. Talk about the unique challenges that young women in China face when they are advocating for their rights, and how issues of gender discrimination intersect with broader human rights abuses in China. What can be done to address these issues and overcome these barriers?
That's a really great question. I think the challenges are two-folded. The first is from cultural and social pressures. For example, when women who are subject to gender discrimination or sexual harassment, when they speak out, there's always a voice criticizing the women themselves that for example, they must have done something wrong, or they're acting like an over aggressive feminist. So nowadays, like feminism has become a bad word in China. Every woman who live in China faces multiple layers of discrimination at work, in public space, and even in the cyber world. they are being judged for like whether they meet certain criteria for being a decent female who does not wear inappropriate dresses and acting or like not acting like a good wife who takes care of the children and the elderly at home. So if they speak out as a woman, they will face criticism and those inappropriate comments. We can see this in any news or human rights movement. People are always picking on the female activist and judge her at an individual level, personal level, before they hear what she has to say. So I think the second vote is from the top-down political level. Since President Xi Jinping took power in 2012, China has experienced a drop in women's labor force participation, a crackdown on feminist movements, and a push for women to adopt domestic roles during the country's demographic crisis. Because of all the challenges women face, Chinese women just can't do it all, and they stop wanting to get married and have children. So I think like without significant governmental assistance around child rearing and helping women, it's simply too costly to start a family for women. And there is a lack of human rights framework in China. You can't advocate for women's rights and human rights if most people don't even understand what the terms entail. The Chinese authorities avoid talking about human rights and fear that once they open the door for women's rights, it's going to be a slippery slope. People will start to ask like, what about other rights? What about labor rights? What about political rights? And therefore, I think it's essential to establish this human rights framework by talking about it in public and online. If people see the terms more often or regularly hear like different voices and opinions, they would start thinking about it and asking more questions. We would want that intellectual stimulation.
Thank you so much, Yuki. And through your words, we came to know, and we had already known about this before, but then you made it really relevant that human rights violation is not just inflicted on the marginalized communities in China, but also women in general, and also to the civilians in China. Thank you so much, Yuki. And to Anna. Social media has become a vital platform for outreach. We all know that social media is really, really important these days, where individuals, including young people, are actively expressing themselves and sharing their perspectives. Anya, can you tell us how can a young activist effectively utilize digital platforms and social media to raise action on the challenges faced by the marginalized communities in China, given that we all know that China is doing everything in their capacity to have a strong control on the internet and impose censorship. So what can be done to combat these challenges?
Yes, so undoubtedly social media is definitely one of the most influential platform we have these days. And there are actually two things that I want to discuss about social media. So the first part is definitely about information dissemination, creating online campaigns and getting, the knowledge out there of what is actually happening, in the impacted areas. But before I talk about that, I think there's also another very important element that I have come to realize is that since going into exile or since the 2019 movement, the Hong Kong community has been moving out of Hong Kong, right, to different parts of the world. So I'm in the US, but then most people are in the UK and Canada, and then we have people in Australia, Taiwan, Japan, a lot of places. And I think in the very beginning of this huge movement outside of Hong Kong, people felt very lonely because everyone was very traumatized by what happened in Hong Kong, and everyone was trying to settle down in their new country, new host country that they don't know how long they have to spend there for. And this immense sense of loneliness and a lot of trauma, a lot of mental health struggles really compounded on people. But because mental health has always been this huge stigma in Hong Kong society, and I would say in Asian society in general, people really didn't dare to talk about it on social media. So actually what happened was a lot of people started stepping out of social media and stopped using, a lot of platforms because they felt it was too much and too overwhelming to handle. Of course, that's one way to approach it. But another thing that I started seeing was that people, especially young people, I think, started trying to be more open about the mental health challenges they have, about the depression, anxiety, and PTSDs that they have been facing. And by being honest about that, I think slowly people were able to create kind of a virtual online community to support each other, even though they're living, miles away from each other or even on different continents. Somehow people manage to find a way to connect with each other on a very personal and spiritual level on social media and on the internet. And I think that is actually a very important tool and important platform for us as well, because right now it's not only Hong Kong, but I think a lot of our diasporas in exile really need that social media networking platform to stay connected, to create that sense of togetherness, and to create, the hope for us that, even though we're so, scattered around the world, we can still have discussions. We can still feel like a community. We can still share the same sense of identity. So I think, when we're talking about spreading information on social media, it's not just for the sake of campaigning, but I think the other very essential part to it is also for us to maintain that sense of togetherness, that sense of belonging. And right now in Hong Kong is I would, it's kind of fortunate that we still don't have kind of a very strict firewall imposed in Hong Kong yet. So as of now, people in Hong Kong can still kind of communicate with people outside through, Instagram, Facebook, or even listen to, YouTube to find out what people are doing overseas. And that is very important for us right now because I think we fear, splitting into two movements eventually or splitting into two communities eventually, just because how the environment has changed. So social media is really a space for us to stay connected and keep, informed about what the others are thinking, what the others are talking about, what the others are discussing. And that's why right now we're also trying to launch a YouTube channel, to speak to Hong Kongers around the world and just to understand each other's context better. Even things like, we are advocating on the Hill, for example, and there are senators and House representatives. This may not be common knowledge for a lot of Hong Kongers who are outside of the US, but these are important things to know if we want to understand the work that we're doing together and keep and stay motivated. So that's what I think is important, on social media for a global diaspora in exile. But of course, there's also this element of media campaigning, which is also huge. And I really urge young activists to utilize social media platforms and utilize our knowledge of gaming the algorithm, really. I think that is the gift of people of our generation, to try to break the echo chamber, to try to get to, international community and audience that are otherwise not very aware of everything that is happening, in China, in Hong Kong, in Tibet, in southern Mongolia, in a lot of places, and to Uyghurs friends as well. And I think it's really the goal or the burden on our generation because we're so used and adapted to the sort of algorithm that we have been living with, that we have to actually game it to break the echo chamber to get to people who would not, see us on the news, who would not, just stumble upon our protests on the street, and to let them know really what is happening. And also to let them know, what kind of disinformation they have been fed by the China propaganda machine, and to fight against it. And also one last thing, I think social media is also an important space where we can show our solidarity and support for other movements as well. For example, human rights movements around the world, pro-democracy movement around the world, and also general human rights like gender equality. And a lot of these qualities are also something we should get behind, and we can show our solidarity through talking about it on social media and educating our own people at the same time.
Thank you so much, Anna. And yeah, social media is playing a really important role, even though the mainstream media sometimes they don't highlight the issues faced by the marginalized communities in China, the human rights violations. It is the social media that has been disseminating, and the younger generation, they must and they should play a vital role in contributing to their participation in using social media to disseminate the message. Thank you so much, Anna. Martyr, in your role as the head of the communities for the Norwegian Uyghur community, what initiatives or strategies have you employed to raise awareness about the plight of the Uyghurs? And also, how do you see the role of organizations like UTJD and the engagement of youth activists shaping the path towards a more democratic and free China?
Yes, in my role as the head of communication at the Norwegian Uyghur Committee, we do, of course, take like multiple strategies in our awareness raising efforts, and in this sense, we do extensively collaborate with media, for example, utilizing the data that's collected by the UTGD, and engage with academic publication, which is also something I've done a lot, publishing opinion articles or commentaries, issuing press releases, written submission to parliaments, governments, and UN bodies. This is like all a part of what we do on a day-to-day basis. And additionally, we do also organize public events, panel discussions like the seminars and similar activities. And regarding to the role of the UTGD and the involvement of youth activism in shaping a more democratic and free China, it is important to note here that UTGD, like the Transitional Justice Database, functions primarily as a research center focused on data collection and present findings. That's that's all we do there. And advocacy and campaigns are strictly separated from the work of UTGD and fall under the purview of the Norwegian Uyghur Committee, given that it's a two separate organization. And I'll just be very honest here. As the head of communication for the Norwegian Uyghur Committee, my advocacy effort does not really revolve around advocating for a more democratic and free China. Instead, our priority is to advocate for the rights of the Uyghurs and self-determination, because East Turkestan has a historical background of being an occupied land where Uyghurs have previously established independent states and made significant contribution to the human civilizations. But however, since the Communist Party took over the power in 1949, Uyghurs have suffered immensely. Although the Chinese constitution grants us autonomy, but the situation, the reality on the ground is very different than what's written on the constitution. And the Chinese communist reign is considered as one of the darkest chapters of the Uyghurs' history, and nowadays the very existence of the Uyghur people is under threat. Just like we know, the Chinese regime has consistently disregarded international norms and its own constitution. Autonomy is therefore not possible, I believe, as long as China is under an authoritarian rule. And as a people who are currently enduring an ongoing genocide, and I doubt that a peaceful coexistence between Uyghurs and either a democratic or non-democratic China is I believe it's not a realistic scenario at any point in the future. And it is also important to highlight that all peoples have the right to self-determination. By that right, they freely determine their political status and freely pursue their economic, social, and cultural development. The right to self-determination is recognized under international law as a process that belongs to the people and not to the state or government. And as a people facing a genocide per day, I believe that we have the right to determine our own destiny, and this is the only way to end this decade-long Chinese repression. Thank you.
Thank you, Martyr. And yeah, I agree the fact that even though a community has gained autonomy, it is really difficult for Chinese to let them practice autonomy. Thank you so much, Martyr, for giving us your take on this. And moving on to Temulun. Temulun, as an American-born Southern Mongolian, and like I mentioned, saying that you're as the daughter of Mr. Engabatuk Togochok, the director of Southern Mongolian Human Rights Information Center, you carry a very unique legacy. So how has this influenced your sense of responsibility towards the Southern Mongolian cause? And as a young activist, how do you manage to balance your personal life with your commitment to advocacy work?
That's a really good question. So growing up, I always heard stories about Southern Mongolia and the time, like my father's experiences and just all of Southern Mongolian experiences of being occupied by China and the effect it had on my people. But like as someone who was raised and like born and raised in America, and so as someone who's never been to Southern Mongolia, all of those concepts seemed very distant and foreign to me, and it was hard to like empathize with those feelings because I was in such a different predicament than my relatives, than my cousins, my aunts, my uncles, my grandparents. But all of this changed when in the fall of 2020, I learned that my Mongolian relatives were losing their right to speak and learn their mother tongue. And it just made it more real for me. And all of a sudden it was a more tangible concept that I could understand, and I could put myself in their shoes and I understood their perspective, because I could never imagine not being able to speak my own language, just having that taken away from me. And not even just my own language, because I speak English, but Mongolian, which is so much more sacred and has such a large portion of our culture. I mean, the traditional writing. I mean, so many like children nowadays, nobody really knows how to traditionally write Mongolian anymore because it's an up and down, very difficult but very beautiful script, and it's been replaced by the Cyrillic alphabet. So my parents can still read and write in traditional Mongolian, but that is another art form that is being lost because of external sources and because of this sort of cultural genocide, and it's just such a huge part of the culture, and I just can't stand to see my family, who, even though I've never seen them in person, I can't imagine the position that they're in now, because if we lose this beautiful and unique language, we lose a humongous part of our national identity and our own culture. So afterwards, after I heard about this, I started researching the conditions in Southern Mongolia, and I really understood that the grievances and the struggles of my people are widely unknown to the world. I mean, people don't even know what Southern Mongolia is, which is, how are you supposed to fight for a cause if people don't even know what it is? You know what I mean? They don't even know that we exist. And even within Mongolia itself is very divided. So it's really hard for Southern Mongolians to be able to speak up, because Mongolians from the mainland, Northern Mongolians, they also look down upon Southern Mongolians. I mean, me personally, I have experience with that. I used to go to a Mongolian summer camp, and the kids there would accuse me of being Chinese, and I was like bullied all the time, and I was told I wasn't a real Mongolian. And, you know, of course, the Chinese people are trying to take away our culture, saying our culture isn't valid either. And as a Mongolian American living in America, I was also told, oh, because, you know, you're Mongolian American, you're never going to be truly American, you know. So that's just been a huge part of my identity, like trying to find my own identity in a world that is just constantly pulling in all different directions. And I can't even try to find this, I can't even find an identity for myself. But over time, I've learned to accept the Southern Mongolians, and I've learned to like understand and accept that maybe we aren't being accepted by many people in this world, but that is only more of an incentive for me to fight for this, so people can understand and the Southern Mongolians can unite with the Northern Mongolians and with the Tibetans and the Uyghurs, and we can all stand together to fight against the CCP's oppression. And that's just such an important it's just such an important cause for me now. And it's just really important because I want my children one day to be able to speak Mongolian. I want my children to know my culture. I want my children to be able to wear the traditional clothing and understand this. And I don't want it to be lost. And that's why it's so important for me to hold on to it and to fight for it.
Thank you so much, Temelun, and really sorry that you had to go through a lot of difficulty. And I'm sure it's not just the younger Southern Mongolian youth activists, but also youth activists belonging from various communities are inspired by you. And thank you so much. It was really nice hearing you speak about your experiences and sharing with us about what you went through. Thank you so much, Temelun. Uh, You've advocated for a Tibetan flag emoji with the hashtag insert Tibetan flag. And on the other hand, we all know about the serious issue of DNA collection by the Chinese authorities, which is a serious form of repression against the Tibetan people. Pamela, how is students for Free Tibet utilizing digital platforms effectively, not just for cultural representation like that of the Tibetan flag, but also of serious human rights issues such as the mass DNA collection in Tibet? How is digital activism playing a role in the Tibetan freedom movement and its importance in engaging the youth?
I think when it comes to online presence, especially in the case of, at this point, all of the Chinese occupied areas, Tibet, East Turkestan, Southern Mongolia, the Chinese government is trying to create a divide between those that are inside and outside. They try to alienate. So I think that the online presence, like first and foremost, is beneficial for this because but while taking on immense risk on themselves by having VPN or whatnot, there are ways in which young people inside Tibet or like a Uyghur youth in East Turkestan, while taking immense risk by using the VPN, could access some of the content or informations, discussions that are happening amongst the community outside. But I think through SFT, like one of the ways in which we try to use the online space is to help build power as like grassroots spaces. And one of the best examples I can think of for this is really the Tufts Confucius Institute campaign. And so there had been a Confucius Institute at Tufts University for quite a few years, and there had been a campaign for almost 3 or 4 years actually ongoing, in which the university had stalled and just not really taken any action on it, despite a campaign for 3 or 4 years by some local activists and whatnot. And I think one of the first things that when SFT was kind of participating in the campaign, one of the things that we did that was extremely effective and really impactful was we just said, okay, well, if the university won't take the right decision, maybe the president of the university should be directly asked and questioned about this, not just by 1 or 2 people, but by everybody who has a concern about this Confucius Institute. And we set up a way in which within 30 seconds, someone can actually send an email to the president of the university, and that email would be CC'd to all the local politicians in the region. And within 24 hours with online base, we were able to send over 700 letters to the president's email inbox. So one day when the president woke up, he has throughout the day getting 700 emails in which all the local politicians that he works with and meets with are CC'd on, and local community members such as Tibetan former political prisoners, children that are going to school in the community, allies that are students of Tufts that support Tibet, are asking him questions about why he would take Chinese government money for an educational program. And the next day, the next day, the president of Tufts announced that they were closing their CI. So after 4 years of campaigning, it was very difficult to make progress. But after having 700 people just write one email to the president of Tufts, that was possibly the last straw that it took to really convince the president that this was a reputational risk for the university that was worthy enough that it didn't make sense to any longer have this program on their campus. So I think this is just one example of how the online space can make it this letter campaign, email campaign was pushed through Twitter. So it was only through Twitter we were able to really find the success of this campaign. And I think when it comes to the DNA campaign right now, it's an issue of privacy, of security, and also of mass surveillance. And so right now, as many of you guys may know, and those of you who don't, I would just love to share that inside Tibet right now, over 30% of the population have had their DNA cataloged by the Chinese government. And so this is a scenario in which children as young as 5 years old are having their DNA sampled right now. They go to schools, like colonial boarding schools, where children have been separated from their parents, and then they're taking blood samples, extracting blood samples without any consent from the child or the parent. So you see even photographs from the report that's been done by Citizens Lab or Human Rights Watch. You can see photographs where it's recess. It's like the lunch break of the students, and they're running around playing games, and then the police will come in their police uniforms and be the ones who are extracting DNA samples from children during their lunch break while they're trying to play with their friends. So when you think about maybe in 20 years from now, maybe that young person who had their DNA sample today, there's a protest going on in Tibet. If Tibet is still occupied by China, there's a protest going on in Tibet, and they have to think 10 times now before joining that protest, because the Chinese government already has a list of every known relative that they have living anywhere inside Tibet. Let's say there's an activist who's holding, for example, we had a press conference in Athens with some of our Uyghur cross-movement friends like Zumartai, and we did this press conference. At that time, Chinese undercover plane officers came, and when we went to the restroom, they were waiting outside. They were trying to get information about who we are, who our relatives are, where we're from. Imagine if they could just walk into the restroom and try to find a sample of our DNA and be able to know every known relative we have inside Tibet. These types of ways in which this DNA mass collection program, it's so dangerous for the right to free speech, and also the confidence of activists that are working on these issues. But the thing is, when you say DNA mass collection database, it's such a difficult concept for everyday citizens to be able to grasp and connect with. So in that way, we use social media to actually make the issue more accessible to wider masses of people. So we've done reels, which are 30 to 60-second clips where we just share basic information. And these, as Anna mentioned, are really algorithm friendly. So they're really pushed forward by algorithms to access more people. But this content that we created, a 30-second clip with a very simple and flashy explanation of some simple topics, if we had posted that to YouTube, 5 years ago, it would not get tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of views. But when we post it to social media now, with the algorithm and knowing how young people knowing how to create content that does well with the algorithm, we're able to get it in front of the very screen. We have a personal advertisement space where 100,000 people can see that content within 2 or 3 days. So I think the DNA campaign is a really great example of how an issue that's very chunky or difficult to understand for mass content consumers, it's really in the hands of young people to turn it into something that's interesting. So for example, yesterday during the company Thermo Fisher, so Thermo Fisher is the only known company outside of non-Chinese company to be providing actually DNA kits to the Chinese police inside Tibet. to be taking samples from Tibetans. So they had their annual shareholders meeting. This is the day in which all their shareholders, the investors of this company, are meeting together to decide and discuss about the company's progress. And so, we went outside of the company's headquarters and we just, took this photo action, which we use for social media. So now we have this complicated science issue about bioinformatics layered on top of a complicated business issue, which is a shareholders meeting and how do shares work and who holds shares of what. And we're able to turn it into this piece of content that can be easily consumed by people who are wanting to care about Tibet but not knowing about the issue as much. So I think these types of political theater in which you can see the CEO of Mark Casper, the CEO of Thermo Fisher, shaking hands with the president of China, Xi Jinping, with a mock, just a symbolism of a DNA samples being stolen from Tibetans right in front of your very eyes. This can be consumed in 5 or 10 seconds, and it can tell a story of two very complicated business and science-related issues. So I think in these ways, like, young people can really use social media to be able to the digital space to be able to further really strategic issues, really like critical issues that matter not just to Tibetans, but also to Uyghurs and Hong Kongers and others around the world.
Thank you so much, Pamela, for elaborately explaining to us about the mass DNA collection and how serious this is. I think it is really important for everyone to know about its seriousness. And I think the similar action was taken even in Hong Kong, if I'm not wrong, Anna, during the COVID time. In the name of COVID, they wanted the DNA or the saliva or something, I don't know, just to get the information, but they were saying that it is for the COVID security. Anyways, so yeah.
Yeah, so in Hong Kong, the problem was more about surveillance. So what happened was, in the name of COVID, the government asked everyone to install an app on their phone, and that was compulsory. If you're caught, with your phone and you don't have the app installed, they could find you and charge you and even arrest you. So what they did was that you're required to report where you are on the app whenever you enter a public space. You have to say it, or otherwise, again, they would arrest you. And that's the way they do surveillance. And we also published a report on that. And because the government never shared the source code of the app itself, so it was very difficult for people to verify, the extent of surveillance. But that was happening. But I think inside of China, there were cases of more even harsher surveillance and crowd control in the name of COVID.
Okay, thank you so much, Anna, and thank you so much, Pamela. And coming back to Yuki. Yuki, you have been a long-term social network activist, besides being a research fellow at Citizens Power Initiatives for China. In your opinion, what role does social media activism play in the fight for democracy and human rights in China? How can people, especially the youth, utilize these platforms effectively? Like I said, there is this tight internet control and censorship by the Chinese government.
Yeah, I'll speak from the gender and feminist movement perspective. So, in the past few years, social media has played a significant role in mobilizing grassroots feminist movement and initiating policy and judicial changes. So, on Weibo, the Chinese equivalent of Twitter, gender equality activists have protested against sexual harassment, and the stigma around sexual education and employment discrimination. Awakened by the Me Too movement in the US, ordinary Chinese women have started posting their personal stories of discrimination and sexual harassment on social media. As a result, in 2018, the Supreme Court of China listed sexual harassment as grounds for civil lawsuit. That was a landmark decision. And in January 2022, a short video of a woman chained in the doorless shack went viral and on Chinese media. So that event galvanized public rage over injustice and the authorities' incompetence in fighting human trafficking and domestic violence against women in China. So the unprecedented public response to the incident through media advocacy and China's robust Me Too movement has pushed for the passing of the new women's rights protection law, which is a really good start despite the enforcement problems. I think it is like true that Xi Jinping's administration has also heavily censored the Me Too movement and grassroots feminist organizations in the past few years. However, the like a big landmark case, the Xianzi, her sexual harassment lawsuit illustrated the meaning of her legal action was the fact that even though she lost the battle, but still that could provoke more reflection on the real difficulty of being a woman in today's China, and that perhaps the next victim that walks into a courtroom can receive more trust. So I think we should just continue using the social media to tell individual stories and to express opinions despite the censorship. So my organization has worked on providing the technological assistance to promote internet access to information and free media. The authorities cannot silence us all. Big cases like the chained women and Xianzi's case have tremendous impact on Chinese society and the youth body. So I think the goal is to raise awareness and encourage more people to speak out and think about these issues. The Chinese Me Too movement is a good example. There should be constant hashtags tags and conversations around the current events, any political and human rights related events, creating a pop culture in the China specific context on social media.
Thank I'm sorry. Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you, Yuki, for your lovely and really productive response to this social media activism. And I think I will be ending now since we have already crossed our time limit. And it was really, really nice to have all of the young speakers coming on one screen and giving your perspectives and showing a lot of enthusiasm regarding youth activism. And I really hope that we shall meet someday really soon, like maybe physically. I really hope so that will happen. And let us remember that fight for human rights is an ongoing struggle. It requires continued engagement, awareness, and actions from individuals, organizations, and governments worldwide. It is evident that young activists and leaders play a vital role in driving progress and promoting human rights. And I'm also sure that this session has inspired many young people in advocating for their cause and standing up for peace, democracy, and justice. Thank you so much, everyone, for your lovely presence today. And before I end, the video of the session will be uploaded on Asia Freedom Institute's website. And please follow Asia Freedom Institute's Twitter, Facebook, and LinkedIn pages for more information on AFI programs and activities. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you too.
Thank you.